So, did I hear that correct? Is it going to be a quick talk or a critic's talk? Anyhow, welcome to you all to the debate called Out of the Comfort Zone. We have little over an hour to bring you out of your comfort zone. So, not so much for introductions, and let's start. This afternoon's discussion is a cooperation between the film festival and the Dutch film magazine, the Filmkrant, and it's part of an, as you may say, ongoing series of debates and articles and special dossiers in the Filmkrant about film criticism that we baptized some years ago slow criticism, as an opposition to the fact that a lot of criticism has become more of a commodity and a marketing tool over the years. As a spin-off of that, some of the people who are here on stage met in Ljubljana last fall and discussed contrarian film criticism in a conference called Out of the Grain. And today's talk is sort of a follow-up on that, and we're trying to push the questions we raised there, whether it's a responsibility to be a contrarian film critic, a little further. So I'm going to introduce you to our guests and comrades and co-conspirators, and hopefully at some point you all are willing to join in the discussion so we can create a nice little chaos here. Would be interesting, because then the cameramen are going to get crazy and the sound is going to sing around, and then we're really having a ball. So next to me is Chris Fujiwara, who is a critic and a writer and a teacher, and as I like to say, the one person in the world, author of numerous books, who made me understand Jerry Lewis finally, which is kind of hard coming from Europe to understand Jerry Lewis. Next to him is Neil Young, critic at large, curator, programmer, program advisor, what else? Traveling cinema man. Next to him is Christina Nord from Germany, film editor for the Taz, Tageszeitung, a German newspaper with a very good and precise film policy, and I'd hope to hear more about that. Next to her is Adrian Martin, and I'm really especially proud to present him to you because he's also a columnist for the Filmkrant, also writer, teacher, professor at Monash University, but also someone who used to write weekly film criticism books, from Mad Max to Movie Mutations. And at the rear end is Gabe Klinger, also one of those vagabonds of film traveling, curator, very fine thinker, and he's going to co-host to this program with me, and I'm Dana Linsen, editor-in-chief of the Filmkrant. So we're going to start with some quick thoughts on contrarianism, and then we're hitting it off. And I'm going to start with Adrian, and you're going to talk a little bit about Manny Farber, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Dana. Yes, well, perhaps just to sort of get into our discussion here today, and this theme of contrarian film criticism, and what is that? What are we talking about? And partly it's a discussion that's been going on, like between a lot of critics and their readers on the internet and in magazines and so on, about basically how critics sort of take their positions, and sometimes take very strong positions, and hold not just opinions but sort of fighting opinions. They're sort of reacting against sort of the dominant opinion or the dominant sort of culture in the air around film. And there've been a number of cases that have come up that have been really discussed in recent years, such as the American reviewer Armand White, who sort of makes a habit of being a contrarian. Everything that he thinks everybody else likes, he goes against. And he tries to make a political point about that, well or badly. And it's been suggested, for instance, by our colleague Richard Porton, writing in the Filmkrant, that perhaps it's a responsibility or an obligation of a critic to be somewhat contrarian, to go against received opinion and against the dominant culture of film. From my position personally, I think it's important not to turn this sort of contrarian idea into a kind of a fixed religion or a fixed position, because that would be as useless as anything else. You know, to be always against becomes sort of meaningless at a certain point. Like, for instance, in my experience in Australia, where I come from, it was like there was like a war between generations, and the generation older than me were the generation of film critics who loved, for instance, Ingmar Bergman. You know, for them, Bergman was the god of cinema, right? So then, when my generation came along, we had to, of course, defy our mothers and fathers and go, down with Ingmar Bergman. You know, it's time for, you know, horror movies and David Cronenberg, David Lynch, you know, Raoul Ruiz and whoever it was that we wanted to say replaced this sort of canon, this basically very European canon of the great art film. But of course, you can't stick with those sort of positions forever because, you know, at a certain point, you got to wake up one day and say, hey, that Ingmar Bergman guy wasn't too bad after all. You know, like, we needed to have that fight, we needed to have that debate, we needed to separate ourselves from this like dominant opinion and criticise it and qualify it. But at the end of the day, you know, you've got to broaden your frame of reference and not get sort of stuck into one thing, whether it's, you know, highbrow art or whether it's, you know, some kind of lowbrow popular culture. For me, the important thing is to constantly go back and forth between all the different sorts of cultures of film, all the different sorts of types of film, and try to work the connections. This is the significance, for instance, of the American critic that Dana mentioned, Manny Farber, who died just a couple of years ago. Is, you know, a big hero, I guess, to many of us, several of us on the stage. And Farber, who was a painter as well as a film critic, he basically approached all films with the same eye, literally, with this painter's eye. And for him, you know, the problems of space and composition and action and gesture, for him they were exactly the same if it was like a Val Lewton movie from the 1940s, like I Walk with a Zombie. Exactly the same in I Walk with a Zombie to a film by Straub and Huillet, you know, some very severe, minimalistic, you know, cheap film. And for him, there was no difference. That was the whole thing that he worked on. He never said, oh, well, this is a lowbrow Hollywood film and now we're looking at a severe minimalist, you know, whatever film. He would just talk about them in the same sentence, literally. He would say, the problem of how to do this is evident here and it's evident there. And through doing that, and through not making a big point of doing it, just by doing it, he actually changed a lot in the way that people write film criticism and how they approach cinema. And my personal opinion, which I've come to over a long time, is that any like fixed taste, any sort of niche, as we say in culture, like when people say, I'm just into horror movies, or I'm just into a certain kind of European art cinema, or whatever it is, I'm just into the avant-garde, I'm just into something else. That's always a trap. Like taste, in that sense, to have that taste is a prison. I always think of taste as a prison, and that you've got to absolutely smash out of the prison, smash out of the comfort zone in this way and start to make the connections between all the different kinds of cinema. So I'll pass on.
Okay, thanks, Adrian. So I'm going to give the mic to Christina, who's probably going to follow up a little bit about that and how it works out in everyday practice. And meanwhile, I'm going to ask the very nice Farid, who promised us some water, because we might need some. Thank you, Christina.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me here. And thank you for your brief statement. I'd like to get back to that thought you mentioned about being a contrarian is something like living in a comfort zone, because I find that very interesting. And I think the idea we had before the conference in Ljubljana, for instance, was like being a contrarian is like going against the grain and leaving the comfort zone. Now, you said something which I found very interesting. Being a contrarian can be staying in your own personal comfort zone of your taste and your likes and dislikes. And I think that's indeed a danger. And I think there's something about contrarianism. It might be in many ways very important, but on the other hand, it can never be something which is an end in its own. And it can be something which is very self-indulgent. And I also think that if me being a film critic, if I'm convinced that I do have like the authority and the power to chase people out of the comfort zone because I know more than they do, I think there's something wrong in this concept. Maybe that was something which worked 30 years ago when cinema was still like more marginalized than it is today in cultural debate and discussion. But I think this has changed. On the other hand, of course, I see that in my daily work as a film editor of a German newspaper, I can clearly see that many of the things I'm interested in are not really popular among my colleagues, and they are not popular among other German film critics, at least not among other, let's say, film editors who are responsible for cinema sections in their newspapers. And one thing I'm trying in my everyday practice is to create a space for these films and these filmmakers I'm interested in. And for instance, in Ljubljana, I talked about very long films, for instance, films by Love Diaz, which, as you know, take like 9 hours or 10 hours or 11 hours, and they are very rarely screened because there's no commercial value in them. You can't make money showing a Love Diaz film. So there are very few spaces where they are shown, and the very moment there is, for instance, in Berlin a screening of a Love Diaz film, I try to publish a big piece about him. But I've been doing that for quite a while, and I realized that I can't do this exclusively. Like, if I only do Love Diaz, if I only do Apichapong Veracetakul, if I only do Lisandro Alonso, Lucrecia Martel, films that are rarely shown in Germany, films that are not mainstream, that not a lot of people have access to see, and not everybody is like going to get everything out of the internet. I have like to find other options as well, and I think that's some kind of a daily task, and I think you can enjoy it a lot. Yeah, that's all for now.
Okay, thanks, Christina. Now I would like to hand over the microphone to Chris, because yesterday when we were prepping this talk, you were saying that it's also a task of a critic to invite the audience to go out of their comfort zone, and I was hoping you could say a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, actually, I'm going to start from Manny Farber again, and maybe my idea is not so much to invite the audience, but to reject the audience. And Manny Farber actually wrote a piece, a very famous one, called "Blame the Audience." In effect, blame the audience for what's wrong with the appreciation of films today and the place of films, and which films are valued higher than others. And what Christina just said may be true, that maybe the sort of battles of taste that Manny Farber and other people fought really, maybe that's not an appropriate model for us anymore. Maybe it is 30 years or more ago when, when it was meaningful to have to fight for a Val Lewton or something. But I'm going to take a different tack, I think, from what Christina and also even from what Adrian was saying, because I think that for better or worse, I do think that the critic should oppose something. And what I think the critic should oppose these days is the audience. I think the audience needs to be opposed. And the way I got this idea was just before I left for Rotterdam. I also teach, so I teach undergraduates a film course.